It's strange how a single sentence can cut deeper than years of silence. Hi, my name is Emily. I'm 28 years old, and today I want to tell you about the most painful betrayal I've ever experienced. It wasn't from a stranger or a distant relative. It came from the very person I trusted most, my own brother. You see, I believed in him. I believed so much that when he came to me with his dream of opening a restaurant, I didn't hesitate. I invested $50,000 of my savings, money I had been putting aside for years, money that could have been my future home or my safety net. But instead, I gave it to him. Not as a loan with interest, not as a cold business transaction, but as an act of love and faith. For months, I watched him pour his energy into the project. I helped whenever I could, even though I was juggling my own job and responsibilities. I told myself, this is what family does. This is what being a sister means. And I was proud that together we were building something that could change his life. But then came the night that changed everything. At a gathering, surrounded by friends, customers, and even people I barely knew, my brother told everyone that I was stingy, that I was lazy, that I hadn't truly helped him at all. His words weren't just casual complaints. They were sharp knives disguised as jokes, each one making me smaller in the eyes of others. And in that moment, I realized something heartbreaking. Sometimes, the people we sacrifice the most for are the very ones who hurt us the deepest. I know I'm not the only one who's been here. Maybe you've given your all to someone, a partner, a friend, a family member, only to be painted as the villain in their story. It's a pain that mixes anger with disbelief, leaving you questioning everything, your choices, your kindness, even your worth. That night, as my brother's words echoed in my head, I couldn't stop replaying every sacrifice I had made for him, the countless hours of encouragement, the financial risk I had taken, the dreams I had put on hold so that his could move forward. And yet, to him, it was never enough. To him, I was still the stingy sister who hadn't given more. I walked out of that party with my chest tight, wondering, how could someone I love so deeply twist the truth so cruelly? Why do some people only see what you didn't do instead of everything you did? In this video, I'm going to share with you the full story. From the moment I first decided to invest in my brother's dream, to the night his words shattered my faith in him, to the difficult choices I had to make after. Because what happened next is something I never imagined I'd have to face. So if you've ever felt unappreciated, betrayed, or taken for granted by someone close to you, stay with me. I promise you this story isn't just about pain. It's also about strength, boundaries, and the courage to put yourself first when no one else will. And before we dive in, I'd love for you to subscribe to my channel. That way, you won't miss any of the powerful stories we share here. Stories that remind us we're not alone in our struggles. I still remember the first time my brother told me about his dream. We were sitting at our parents' kitchen table, sipping coffee late into the night, when he leaned forward with that spark in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. "Emily," he said, "I want to open my own restaurant. Not just any restaurant, one that feels alive, like home, with flavors that tell a story." His voice shook with excitement, and as I listened, I couldn't help but picture him finally finding his place in the world. For a long time, he had jumped from job to job, always restless, always chasing something just out of reach. But that night, his words felt different. They carried weight, like this wasn't just another idea. This was the one. At first, I thought he was just sharing a dream, like people do when they're tired or nostalgic. But then he pulled out sketches of a logo, notes scribbled on napkins, even a half-finished business plan. I could see he had been quietly preparing for this moment, waiting for someone to take him seriously. And that someone, of course, was me. I had always been his anchor, the person he called when things went wrong, the one who covered his rent when he fell short, the sister who believed in his potential even when no one else did. So when he asked me, "Do you think I can really do this?" I didn't hesitate. I told him yes. But believing in him and funding his dream were two very different things. He wasn't just talking about recipes and decor. He was talking about startup costs, equipment, renovations, and licensing. The numbers added up quickly, and when he finally admitted he needed $50,000, I froze. That amount wasn't just spare change lying around. It was my future. I had been saving for years, cutting corners, skipping vacations, dreaming of the day I could put a down payment on a small house of my own. Handing it over meant pressing pause on my own dreams. I wrestled with the decision for days. I'd go to work, stare at my computer, and find my mind wandering back to his hopeful expression. I'd lie in bed at night, running calculations in my head, thinking of all the risks. What if the restaurant failed? What if the market was too competitive? What if I lost everything? But then I'd remember the way his voice cracked when he said, "This is my chance, Em. My one real chance." It wasn't just about business for him. It was about identity, about finally proving to himself and to the world that he could succeed. Finally, I said yes. I wrote him a check for $50,000, my hands trembling as I signed it. He hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering over and over, "You won't regret this. I promise. You won't regret this." In that moment, I felt both terrified and proud. I had just risked my financial security, but I had also done something powerful. I had invested in family, in love, in the belief that dreams were worth chasing. The first few weeks were a whirlwind. I watched him throw himself into the project with relentless energy, meeting contractors, interviewing potential staff, tasting dishes until his stomach hurt. He called me late at night to update me on progress, sometimes so excited he could barely get the words out. "Em, you should see the tile we picked for the kitchen." Or, "You won't believe how good this sauce turned out." His joy was contagious, and for a while, I let myself believe that everything would work out exactly as he promised. But even in the middle of his excitement, little cracks began to appear. He was impulsive with money, buying expensive equipment he didn't really need, insisting on premium decor when a simpler option would have worked just as well. I tried to gently remind him of the budget, saying things like, "Maybe we should wait before spending on that." But he brushed me off with a smile. "Don't worry, Emily, you'll see. It's going to pay off. People want quality, and that's what we're giving them." I wanted to trust him, but a quiet unease started gnawing at me. There were also moments when he seemed to forget I wasn't just a silent investor. I'd ask questions about finances or timelines, and he'd wave me off like I was a child poking into grown-up matters. "I've got it handled," he'd say, his tone sharp enough to sting. It was strange. He had begged me for support, but once he had it, he acted as though my voice didn't matter. Still, I swallowed my discomfort and kept telling myself that he was just stressed, that once the restaurant opened, things would settle. Friends and family began to notice, too. They'd hear about the restaurant and congratulate him, sometimes in front of me, saying things like, "Wow, you're really doing this all on your own." He would smile, basking in the praise, never once mentioning the sacrifice I had made. At first, I brushed it off, thinking he'd acknowledge me eventually, but as the pattern repeated, I felt invisible, like my contribution had been erased. I wasn't looking for applause, but I did hope for gratitude, or at least recognition that I wasn't just a spectator in this story. Despite these warning signs, I held on to hope. I told myself that family was messy, that gratitude sometimes shows up in unexpected ways, that love meant patience. I poured myself into supporting him however I could, helping with small tasks, encouraging him when he doubted himself, even showing up on weekends to clean or taste test recipes. And though part of me worried about the silence surrounding my role, another part kept whispering, "It will all be worth it once the doors open." The grand opening was approaching, and excitement filled the air. Flyers went out, the staff practiced their routines, and my brother seemed more alive than I had ever seen him. I stood in the middle of the restaurant one evening before the launch, looking around at the polished tables, the warm lighting, the smell of fresh paint and spices mingling in the air. For a brief, shining moment, I believed in the fairy tale, that we had done something remarkable together, that this would be the beginning of a beautiful new chapter for our family. I couldn't have known then that the night of celebration would also be the night everything began to unravel. The night of the grand opening felt like stepping into a dream. The restaurant was buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of garlic, rosemary, and sizzling meat drifting through the air. My brother moved from table to table like a star, shaking hands, posing for photos, accepting compliments with the ease of someone who had finally found his stage. I stood back, watching with quiet pride, a glass of wine in my hand and a lump in my throat. This was his moment, and in a strange way, it felt like mine too. We had built this together. At least, that's what I thought at the time. The first weeks were a blur of energy. Crowds filled the tables, online reviews praised the atmosphere, and local blogs wrote features about the new hidden gem downtown. My brother glowed with adrenaline, riding the high of every compliment, every sold-out night. He'd call me after closing, his voice hoarse but joyful. "Em, did you see that line outside? People love us." And each time he said, "us," my heart swelled. Maybe all the sacrifices, the anxiety, the sleepless nights worrying about money, they were worth it after all. But success brought its own challenges. Behind the scenes, staff turnover was high, orders were delayed, and the bills piled up faster than the profits. I watched my brother become more impatient, snapping at waiters, demanding perfection, and dismissing suggestions from anyone who tried to help. I offered to go over the financials with him, to bring some organization to the chaos, but he waved me off. "Don't worry, Emily. I've got this. You don't understand how restaurants work." His words stung. How could he forget that none of this would exist without my support? Little by little, his language began to change. In interviews and conversations, he started using "I" instead of "we." I worked day and night to build this. I put everything on the line. I'd be standing right there, smiling politely, even as my stomach twisted. Friends congratulated him endlessly, asking how he managed to pull it off, and he'd bask in the spotlight, never once acknowledging the check I had signed with trembling hands. At first, I told myself he was just overwhelmed, that gratitude might come later. But deep down, a small voice whispered, "He doesn't see you." The tension between us grew. Whenever I asked about expenses or raised concerns, he accused me of being negative. "Why can't you just be supportive?" he'd snap. Supportive, as if $50,000 and months of unpaid help weren't enough. I started to dread our conversations, knowing that any attempt to talk about responsibility would end with me cast as the nagging, ungrateful sister. The roles were reversing in a way I couldn't understand. He was the visionary hero, and I was becoming the obstacle in his story. The restaurant's shine began to dim as the initial excitement faded. The crowds thinned, the reviews became harsher, and debt started to loom like a shadow. My brother grew defensive, blaming staff, suppliers, even customers who didn't get his vision. When I suggested cutting costs or adjusting the menu, he rolled his eyes. "You wouldn't understand. You've never run a business." That sentence sliced through me, because while it was true I had never run a restaurant, I had financed his. Without my sacrifice, there wouldn't even be a business to mismanage. One night, after a particularly slow evening, we sat alone in the empty dining room. The candles had burned down to puddles of wax, and the air smelled faintly of disappointment. I tried to reach him, to remind him that we were in this together. "Maybe we should rethink some strategies," I said gently. He slammed his hand on the table. "This is my dream, Emily. Mine. If you can't handle the pressure, then maybe you shouldn't be involved at all." His words hit me like a slap. Wasn't I the one who had given him this dream in the first place? I began to notice something else. Subtle comments he made in front of others. At first, they seemed like jokes. "Emily's the cautious one. She never takes risks." Or, "She'd probably rather be home than scrubbing dishes here." People laughed, and I forced a smile. But inside, I was shrinking. Each remark chipped away at my dignity, painting me as the hesitant, lazy sister who stood on the sidelines while he carried the weight. It didn't matter that the truth was the exact opposite. What mattered was the story he was telling, and people were starting to believe it. The final straw in this chapter came at a staff gathering one evening. The mood was light, the wine flowing, and everyone was toasting to the bravery of my brother. Someone raised a glass and said, "You really did this all on your own." He grinned, eyes sparkling, and instead of correcting them, he leaned back and replied, "Well, yeah, I guess I'm just not afraid to work hard." Laughter erupted around the table, and I sat there frozen, my cheeks burning. My contribution, my sacrifice, my sleepless nights, it had all been erased in a single, careless moment. I left that night with a knot in my stomach and a question I couldn't silence. If he could erase me so easily in front of others, what else was he capable of saying when I wasn't around? The first time my brother openly belittled me in front of customers, I wanted to believe it was just a slip of the tongue. We were hosting a small dinner service when one of his regulars complimented the restaurant's design, asking if I had played a part in it. Instead of acknowledging my involvement, he chuckled and said, "Emily, she's too lazy for this kind of work. She just likes to take credit." The table erupted in laughter, and though I smiled faintly, my hands trembled under the tablecloth. My chest burned, not just from embarrassment, but from the realization that his words carried no trace of affection. They were meant to diminish me. That night, as I drove home, his voice replayed over and over in my head. Lazy. A word so far from the truth it almost sounded absurd, but when spoken aloud in a room full of people, it became a narrative. And narratives, once planted, take root. I thought of the weekends I had given up to help him, the spreadsheets I had organized, the endless encouragement I had offered when he doubted himself. None of it mattered if he could erase it all with one cruel joke. And what hurt most wasn't the laughter of strangers. It was that my own brother wanted it that way. I tried to confront him the next day, pulling him aside before service. "Why would you say something like that about me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He rolled his eyes and shrugged. "Relax, Em. It was just a joke. Don't be so sensitive." His dismissal stung more than the insult itself. To him, my humiliation was entertainment, something light-hearted, easily brushed off. But to me, it was a fracture in our bond, a sign that respect had slipped away without either of us noticing. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. He made me the punchline of his anecdotes, the cautious sibling who never takes risks, the stingy investor who wanted recognition without doing the hard work. Sometimes he'd say it with a smile, sometimes with an edge of bitterness that left no room for misinterpretation. I felt trapped in a role I hadn't chosen, the villain in his story of triumph. And no matter how many times I reminded myself of the truth, I couldn't silence the shame that bloomed in me whenever others laughed at my expense. Friends started pulling me aside, their voices tinged with concern. "Why does he talk about you like that?" one asked quietly after a gathering. I didn't know what to say. If I defended myself, it would sound like bitterness. If I admitted the truth, it would feel like betrayal. So I shrugged, forcing a smile. "That's just how siblings are," I said, though the words tasted like ash. In reality, I was starting to feel like a stranger in my own family, someone whose love and sacrifices had been twisted into caricature. I began withdrawing, both from the restaurant and from him. I stopped volunteering to help with staff training, stopped offering financial advice, stopped showing up at every event. It wasn't a decision I made all at once. It was a gradual fading, like pulling my hand away from a flame that had burned me too many times. But even as I created distance, a knot of guilt grew inside me. Was I abandoning him at the moment he needed me most? Or was I finally protecting myself from a cycle that would only leave me more bruised? Late at night, I'd sit alone in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment that had brought us here. I remembered the little boy who used to follow me around the backyard, begging me to teach him games, trusting me with his secrets. I remembered the teenager who called me first when he got his driver's license, eager to share every milestone. That brother felt like a ghost now, someone I couldn't quite reach no matter how hard I tried, and I couldn't decide which hurt more, losing my money or losing him. The hardest part was seeing my parents' confusion. They adored both of us, and though they never said it outright, I could feel their questions hovering in the air. Why wasn't I around the restaurant as much? Why did I seem distant when my brother spoke so proudly of his hard work? I wanted to scream the truth, to lay out the sacrifices I had made, the insults I had endured, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear of shattering their image of harmony, but I stayed silent. And in that silence, his version of the story grew stronger. One evening, I forced myself to attend another of his gatherings, determined to put on a brave face. As the night went on, the wine loosened tongues, and once again, I became his target. "Emily's great at saving money," he announced with a smirk. "Too bad she's too stingy to ever enjoy life. I mean, she gave me something for this restaurant, but trust me, It wasn't much. The room roared with laughter, and I felt my heart drop into my stomach. $50,000, my entire future savings, reduced to a not much. I excused myself quietly, slipping out into the cold night air, my hands shaking as I pulled my coat tight. As I stood under the streetlights, the sound of laughter spilling from the restaurant behind me, I realized with chilling clarity that this wasn't just a phase or a misunderstanding. My brother had rewritten our story in a way that elevated him and erased me, and he had no intention of changing it. The question that haunted me was no longer, why would he say this, but how much further will he go? The night I walked out of his gathering, leaving behind the sound of laughter at my expense, something inside me shifted. For weeks, I had endured the jokes, the diminishing comments, the erasure of my sacrifices. I told myself it was temporary, that he was stressed, that I could swallow my pride for the sake of family. But that evening, as the cold air bit at my skin, I understood with piercing clarity that silence was no longer protection. It was surrender. And I couldn't keep surrendering pieces of myself just to protect his ego. The next morning, I called him. My voice was calm, steadier than I felt. "We need to talk," I said. He sighed, already irritated, as if I were asking for a favor instead of demanding respect. When we met later that day, I laid it out plainly. The jokes had to stop, the lies about my role had to end, and I deserved acknowledgement for what I had given. He leaned back in his chair, smirking, and said, "You're overreacting. No one takes those comments seriously. Why do you always have to make things about you?" My chest tightened. All I had asked for was the truth, and even that felt like too much for him. I wanted to scream, to list every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar I had handed over. But as I looked at him, I realized none of it would matter. He had built a narrative that served him, and he wasn't going to dismantle it just because I was bleeding underneath. Instead, I said quietly, "If you can't respect me, then I need to step away." His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw not just arrogance, but a flash of fear that I might actually pull the one thread holding his illusion together. Withdrawing wasn't easy. The restaurant had become a second home for me, even with all the pain it carried. Walking away meant not just distancing myself from him, but also from the dream I had poured my heart and savings into. At first, I still stopped by occasionally, lingering in the background, but each visit left me smaller, more invisible. Staff looked at me with puzzled eyes, unsure if I was part of the story or just a forgotten detail. Eventually, I stopped going altogether. I told myself it was self-preservation, but it felt like grieving a loss I couldn't name. My parents began to notice the distance. At Sunday dinners, my mother would glance between us, her brow furrowed as if trying to read a language we weren't speaking aloud. "Is everything okay?" she'd ask gently. My brother would laugh, deflecting with charm, and I'd force a smile. "We're fine," I'd lie, even as the silence between us grew heavier. Protecting them from the truth felt like one last act of loyalty, but it also chained me to the shadows of his version of the story. And every time I bit my tongue, I felt the weight of invisibility pressing harder on my chest. The real breaking point came at a family barbecue. Surrounded by cousins and neighbors, my brother once again painted himself as the self-made hero. "It was all about hard work," he declared, raising his glass. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Emily helped a little, but you know how she is, always too careful, never really diving in." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and this time, I didn't smile. I stood there, heat rushing to my face, my hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. Something inside me snapped. I turned to him, my voice sharper than I intended. "Enough! Stop pretending I didn't sacrifice for you. Stop erasing me." The laughter died instantly, and a silence fell over the group. My brother's face hardened, and for a moment I thought he might actually admit the truth. Instead, he chuckled coldly. "Wow, Em. You really do love being the victim, don't you?" The words hung in the air like poison, and I realized then that this wasn't a battle I could win in front of others. His grip on the narrative was too strong, and my dignity was crumbling every time I fought on his stage. That night, alone in my room, I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. It wasn't just sadness, It was rage, betrayal, and the crushing weight of invisibility. I thought of all the times I had stood by him, all the ways I had believed in him when no one else did, and how he had twisted that love into weakness. But in the hollow ache of those tears, a new voice rose inside me, a voice that said, "You deserve more than this. You deserve respect, even if it doesn't come from him." In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild the boundaries I had let crumble. I stopped answering every call, stopped rushing to his side at the first sign of crisis. When people asked about the restaurant, I offered a polite smile and changed the subject, refusing to let myself be dragged back into his narrative. It wasn't easy. Guilt clawed at me, whispering that I was abandoning him, that I was selfish for pulling away. But slowly, the guilt began to loosen its grip, replaced by something stronger: self-preservation. I knew I couldn't rewrite his story, not in the eyes of those who had already chosen to believe it, but I could write my own. I could choose dignity over humiliation, truth over silence, healing over sacrifice. The road ahead felt uncertain, but for the first time, it was mine. And yet, even as I tried to step forward, I couldn't shake the question that lingered like a storm on the horizon. What would happen the next time he decided to turn his words against me? The weeks after the barbecue were strangely quiet. For the first time in months, my phone wasn't buzzing constantly with his calls, demands, or updates. At first, the silence felt unsettling, like a missing limb I wasn't sure how to live without. But slowly, it began to feel like air filling my lungs again. For so long, my world had revolved around his dream, his restaurant, his narrative. Now, without his voice in my ear, I began to hear something else, my own. I threw myself into routines that had nothing to do with him. I cooked for myself. Instead of taste testing his recipes, I went for long walks without glancing at my phone, and I finally opened the notebook where I had written my own goals years earlier. They weren't grand dreams like opening a restaurant, but they were mine. Saving for a home, traveling to places I'd only seen in pictures, taking classes I had postponed in the name of supporting family. With every page I turned, I felt the sting of regret, but also the spark of possibility. Of course, he didn't stay silent forever. One evening, he showed up at my apartment unannounced, his expression caught somewhere between anger and desperation. "Why are you shutting me out?" he demanded, as though I owed him an explanation for reclaiming my life. I stayed calm, though my heart pounded in my chest. "Because I can't keep letting you humiliate me," I said. His laugh was bitter. "Humiliate you? Emily, you're so dramatic. Everything I have, I built with my own hands." The words were sharp, but behind them, I saw something else. Fear. Fear that without me, the cracks in his empire might finally show. That conversation ended with him storming out, and I sat alone in the quiet, trembling but resolute. For years, I had defined myself by my loyalty, by how much I could give, by how well I could support. But loyalty without respect is just self-destruction. That night, I whispered aloud a promise to myself: no more. I would no longer let my worth be measured by how useful I was to someone else's dream. The following months were a test of that promise. My brother's restaurant began to falter, and though I heard about the struggles through whispers and mutual friends, I stayed away. Every instinct in me screamed to step in, to rescue him, to write another check or roll up my sleeves. But I held my ground. It was excruciating, watching him stumble, knowing I could ease his burden. Yet, I knew that stepping in would only tighten the chain between us, a chain I had finally begun to break. My family struggled to understand. My parents asked gentle but pressing questions. "Why aren't you helping him? Why are you so distant?" I bit back the truth, not out of shame anymore, but out of exhaustion. Explaining the years of manipulation, the cruel jokes, the erasure of my sacrifices felt like pouring salt into wounds no one else wanted to see. Instead, I simply said, "I need space." And though it hurt to see disappointment flicker in their eyes, I reminded myself that I wasn't responsible for carrying everyone else's expectations anymore. One afternoon, I bumped into a former employee from the restaurant at a cafe. She greeted me warmly, then hesitated before saying, "I always wondered why you weren't around more. We all knew you were the one who made it possible." Her words landed like a balm on my heart. For the first time in a long time, someone acknowledged the truth without me having to beg for it. It reminded me that even if my brother tried to erase me, reality had a way of seeping through the cracks. Not everyone was blind to what I had done. As the distance grew, so did my strength. I began to invest not in someone else's dream, but in my own stability. I rebuilt my savings. Slowly but surely, each dollar a reminder that I could create security for myself again. I took a trip alone to the coast, walking barefoot on the sand, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors I had forgotten to notice. For the first time in years, I felt present in my own life, not as someone's support system, not as someone's financial crutch, but simply as me. My brother tried to pull me back a few more times, sometimes with guilt, sometimes with anger, sometimes with empty promises of change. But each time, I stood firm. The truth was clear now. I couldn't save him without losing myself, and I refused to disappear any further. I still loved him. I always would. But love without boundaries had nearly destroyed me. Now, my love had to take a different form. From a distance, without sacrifice, without silence. The last time we spoke, he accused me once more of being stingy and lazy, the very words that had haunted me from the beginning. But instead of shrinking under them, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Those words no longer defined me. They were his shield, not my truth. I hung up the phone that night and realized that freedom doesn't always come with closure. Sometimes it comes with choosing yourself, even if no one else understands. And though the pain of betrayal still lingered, there was also something else growing inside me. Something fierce, something steady. For the first time in this entire journey, I wasn't waiting for his approval or anyone else's. I was standing on my own, with scars that told a story not of weakness, but of survival. What I didn't know then was that this choice, as heartbreaking as it felt, would open doors I hadn't dared to imagine. When I look back on everything that happened, the check I wrote, the laughter that stung, the silence I carried, I realized this story was never just about money. It was about love, loyalty, and the heartbreaking truth that sometimes the people we give the most to are the very ones who take us for granted. For a long time, I thought the betrayal defined me. I thought being called stingy, lazy, invisible meant that somehow I had failed as a sister. But the truth is, it wasn't about who I was. It was about who he chose to be. Letting go wasn't simple. I carried guilt like a shadow, wondering if stepping back made me cold or selfish. But over time, I began to see it differently. Protecting myself didn't mean I loved him any less. It meant I finally loved myself enough to draw the line. And maybe that's the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes, love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's sacrifice that eats you alive until there's nothing left of who you are. I don't know what will happen to my brother's restaurant or to our relationship. Maybe one day we'll find a way back to each other, maybe we won't. What I do know is that I can't keep waiting for an apology that may never come. I can't keep tying my worth to someone else's gratitude. My worth isn't measured in how much I give or how quietly I endure. It's measured in how bravely I stand when the ground beneath me shakes. And if you've ever been in a place where you felt unseen, unappreciated, or erased, I want you to know your worth is not up for debate. Walking away didn't erase the pain, but it gave me something even more important: clarity. I can choose who I let close. I can choose whose voices I allow to define me, and I can choose to build a life that belongs to me. That's the beauty of starting over. It doesn't erase what happened, but it reminds you that you still have power, even after the deepest wounds. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in my story, I want you to take this with you. You are not weak for giving, but you are strong for knowing when to stop. You are not unkind for protecting your peace, but you are wise for refusing to let others decide your worth. And most of all, you are not alone. There are so many of us carrying scars from people we loved deeply, scars that remind us not of our failures, but of our strength to survive. This channel exists for stories like mine, for moments where vulnerability meets courage, where heartbreak becomes wisdom, and where silence is finally broken. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you feel seen or gave you the courage to stand taller, I'd love for you to subscribe. That way, you'll be part of a community that believes in turning pain into power, betrayal into boundaries, and endings into new beginnings. So please, before you leave, click that subscribe button. Join me, not just to hear my stories, but to share in the stories that connect us all. The stories that remind us that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone.